The title East to the Dawn was actually my husband's contribution to the book. I had a very trendy title, Amelia Earhart, An Extraordinary Woman, and we decided it had to be something really much more interesting, and he came up with East to the Dawn, which I thought was brilliant. It means that her major flights were from west to east, and she was on her solo flight across the Atlantic flying into the dawn. She was on her first flight where she was just a passenger from Newfoundland to Europe flying into the dawn, and on her solo flight from Hawaii to California she was flying into the dawn. And then of course on the last flight where she was lost flying into the dawn. She was born in 1897, and this is the 100th anniversary of her birth. She was the most remarkable woman that I knew, and I had a special reason actually, because my mother was one of the early flyers. So she was kind of always there for me. She flew out of the Red Bank Airport in Red Bank, New Jersey in the 30s. She did a lot before the war, and then in the beginning of the war, before anything got really serious, she was in the Civil Air Patrol and patrolled the Jersey coast. I thought about it, but by the time I was old enough to fly, it was after the war and after the Second World War, and I just kind of got on to other things. She was a member of the 99s, yes. Over 6,500 members. It's a women's flying organization. It's really the flying organization where all the women join, and then they support each other, and they have various programs. That's Eugene Vidal and Amelia Earhart. Eugene Vidal is the father of Gore Vidal. He was the great love of Amelia's life. He was also the head of the Bureau of Air Commerce, so he was the highest civilian. That's the highest civilian post in aviation then. She used to wear men's underwear, and she was too embarrassed to buy it herself, so his father used to buy it. Well, it was more comfortable. Women's underwear at that point, women didn't wear slacks, they didn't wear pants, and so they wore kind of silk things that didn't work well under pants. So Jean bought her, I think, jockey briefs that worked out better. She would have been a combination of the greatest, like Gina Yeager. I just don't know. If I say that, there probably are people who have never heard of Gina Yeager. She was the most famous woman in America. She was probably the most famous woman in the world. During her lifetime, she was catapulted to fame because she was the first woman to fly the Atlantic when it seemed as if nobody could fly the Atlantic without dropping into the sea. And then she went on to become a fine flyer, and she spent her life on the lecture circuit in the public eye deliberately. And then she wrote 3 books. I don't think there's anybody really on our present day scene who could possibly be all the things she was at the time. It's a picture. It's just a picture of her after one of her flights. I'm actually not sure which one. It comes from one of the archives. She was 5'8". She weighed 118 pounds. She was skinny. She was very good looking, except she had thick ankles. She hated her ankles, according to Gore Vidal. She was obsessed, even when she was famous, with her ankles, which is one of the reasons why she always wore pants, because it showed off the best of her figure and hid the worst. And she had absolutely beautiful hands, long tapering fingers that her husband was in love with. There were really 2 great loves in her life. One she married, that was George Putnam, and one she didn't, that was Eugene Vidal. George Putnam was a publisher, a very good publisher, and an extrovert, an entrepreneur, who was famous in his own right. He was the publisher who snared Lindbergh, which was the greatest publishing coup of that era, and put him on the map. And he also published all the other explorers and adventurers. He was really in love with the great outdoors and adventurers. And when he kind of stumbled onto Amelia Earhart, he was just totally bowled over, because she was everything. She was his dream woman. Well, they actually met when he interviewed her. He had been given the job of finding a woman to fly the Atlantic in the place of Amy Guest, who had bought an airplane and planned to fly and be the first woman to fly the Atlantic. And it was her notion that she would take off from the United States, fly to London, land in the Thames in front of the Houses of Parliament, and it was going to be a gesture of friendship between the United States and England. So therefore she named the plane Friendship. And she was from a very wealthy family, and she was 55, very headstrong, very intelligent, and her family didn't know what she was about. She kept it quite quiet. And she had Commander Byrd helping her organize this, and he found her the plane, he found her the pilot, he found her the co-pilot. And then when her family found out about it, they, not too surprisingly, hit the roof. And so they talked her out of it. And so she said, stubborn lady, she said, well, okay, I won't do it, but then it has to be, it has to continue, the project has to continue, and I want my place taken by an American woman who will be a credit to her sex and a credit to her country. Has to be somebody educated, a flyer, and a wonderful person, because there were various people, various women who were trying to be that first woman, who wanted to be the first woman across the Atlantic, because they knew that they'd become the most famous woman in the world if they could just get on a plane. And there was one in particular, one woman by the name of Mabel Ball, who was just after the publicity, and she was very good at getting publicity, and she had fashioned herself a vest of a gold link vest with diamond buttons and a platinum collar, and she had huge diamonds on her hands, and as the New York Times said, just to be photographed upon landing in that outfit was to her the dream of a lifetime. And she was always shopping and doing all the things that, and garnering publicity and doing all the things that Amy Guest thought was terrible. And there were other people also that wanted to be the first famous woman to fly across the Atlantic. So for those reasons, Amy Guest had decided that she just had to do this. She was an American, although her husband was English. She lived in London and in Long Island. It was a Fokker with 3 engines, huge, just one of the best planes of the day. Pontoons. We're talking about 1928. We're talking about the year after Lindbergh. Lindbergh had won something called the Ortegue, which had fired up the world's imagination, which was to fly from New York to Paris. And Raymond Ortegue, a Frenchman, had put up $25,000 to the first person who could accomplish this. And many tried, many died. Lindbergh was the first to succeed. He flew from Roosevelt Field to Le Bourget, Long Island, in Paris. And it took him 33 hours. Because women were afraid of flying, so one of the reasons why, but this comes later, a few years later, when airlines started to come into being, they decided that they had to give publicity to women so that women would begin to think that they could, in fact, fly, and that men would realize that if women flew, they shouldn't be afraid of airplanes. I live in Pine Plains, New York, That's 100 miles north of the city. 15 years. I tried to make a living at writing, but I really find it very difficult. It's almost impossible. I got as far as a master's degree at Columbia, political science. Well, I went wherever it took me. I went out to Ohio to visit Katz Chalice, who was one of Amelia Earhart's dearest friends and cousins. I went to, well, she died after I interviewed her. I interviewed her in 1989, 10 years. I went to Newfoundland. I went up to Trepassey, and then I went to Harbor Grace to see the field where Amelia Earhart took off on her solo flight, and Trepassey is where she, where the Friendship took off from. Newfoundland juts out. If you look at a map of North America, you see that Newfoundland juts out as far east as, it's the furthest eastern point. It's the closest to Europe. Yes, many, particularly the field in Harbor Grace was the takeoff point for many planes. Well, I spent a lot of time at the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge. Well, because they had most of the Amelia Earhart material that was given by the family. And then I went to Medford, Massachusetts, where Amelia Earhart's sister, who was still alive, lives. She was born in 1900. She's still alive, and she was very helpful. There were just the two of them. There was Muriel Morrissey.
Yeah.
Her name is Muriel Morrissey, and her daughter was very helpful too. It wasn't so much what Muriel Morrissey remembered, although she remembered a great deal. It was more getting from her a feeling of what their life was like. And also she pointed me in quite a few new directions so that I came up with more new material. When they were children, Amelia, the two of them had, in their young, first childish years, very different lives actually, because Amelia was sent to live with her grandmother in Atchison, Kansas, because her grandmother was quite elderly and lonely, although she did have a husband. He was a bit withdrawn, and there had been a few deaths, and so she was sent to live in Atchison with her grandparents and comfort her grandmother. And Muriel lived in Kansas City, but they were always very close, and they were always together in the summer, and there was a lot of visiting back and forth. I visited Muriel in '87, and then I visited her subsequently a few more times. I would keep going back, and she would keep opening her door for me. She was very helpful. She helped, she sent me to her daughter, who also opened the door to more leads, and so I ended up finding more cousins who gave me letters. And so I had letters from cousins that had never been found before. And then besides that, then I had the when I visited Katz Chalice, I was given, after Katz died, by her daughter, I was given diaries. The diaries were fabulous. The diaries of Katz's sister, Lucy, who lived with Amelia when she was older, and when she was married. Let me see, she started out as an adult or as a child, because as she said, she rolled around a lot when she was a kid. She lived in Atchison, Kansas, Kansas City, Kansas, Des Moines, Iowa, St. Paul, Minnesota, Boston, New York. She went to Columbia. Her family originally came from Philadelphia. Yeah. She ended up in California, in the Toluca Lake district outside of LA. There are tons of books about Amelia Earhart. I mean, I'm stunned when if I had realized how many books there were, I probably wouldn't have started. The literature about her is getting longer all the time, too. The thing is that what I found is that the books show a continuing or possibly even a growing interest, which I actually hadn't realized. I think they're probably, right now, I see a growing interest, maybe just because I'm so involved with Amelia Earhart. But I found that the books were really interesting, but you can't rely on books if you're a biographer. You have to go back to source material. Well, I have the it sounds corny to say, but I have the real details of her life, which I found were missing. And it took a lot of digging, took a lot of interviewing, and it took a lot of time, because it isn't the kind of thing you can force. You can't even figure out where you're going to go until each thing happens. And for instance, Gore Vidal had told me that there was a lost biography, and he knew about it because the woman was a friend of his father's as well as of Amelia, and he had spent time with her. And she had advised him about how to go about publishing his first book. And that his first book was accepted, and her first book was turned down, so he knew this. So he said to me that there was this lost biography. And I suppose that he told other people because really it was no secret. But I just happened to find it. So I had this lost biography. And then, of course, I had to rewrite the whole book again. Well, that was a few years ago. And I was in the Schlesinger, and I was not even, I wasn't thinking, I'd just really given up on it. And then as I was going out, I saw that they had recently gotten the papers of Janet Mabie, who was this woman that had written the biography. And it was just that, and I turned on my heels and went back in. It was details. It was, again, details. She had, she was there. And so she was there, and she interviewed people that had known Amelia. And so I had suddenly, at my fingertips, I had anecdotes, things that really happened, not just the general things that we all know. He was married to Dorothy Binney Putnam, who, by all accounts, is quite a woman in her own right, and her granddaughter has just written a book about her. She and Amelia were first friends, and Amelia was enormously grateful to her in 1928. In fact, she dedicated her first book to her because she thought she'd been so helpful. But then she had other interests, actually. Dorothy Binney Putnam had other male interests, and it became obvious that George Palmer Putnam was simply mesmerized by Amelia. And so they got divorced, and then Amelia was not too happy about having anything to do with a divorce, but he overcame all her objections, and they eventually got married. He had to propose to her a number of times by his own admission before she agreed. She was not actually planning on getting married. She'd always, as a child, she and her cousins, the Chalices, Lucy and Catch, had always had great dreams and plans for exciting careers. They'd never really had any plans for great marriage. But he talked her into it. 1931. She's saying that she's not going to be faithful to him, and that he doesn't have to be faithful to her, that he has to let her have her freedom. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I mean, I thought, for me, it kind of showed the steely hand and the velvet glove, which I think I wrote, but because it was, can you imagine doing that with an enormously, I mean, it came from an inner need, but it was also a very gutsy thing to do, and it shows that she had to be the way she was and damn the consequences. Well, actually, I think I found it as definitive source as there is, which is, somebody told me about the writings of a Japanese woman by the name of Fukiko Aoki, who had been a very good writer, who had written a book about it and an article. She'd been the bureau chief of Newsweek, so we're not talking about somebody that is inconsequential or doesn't know what she's doing. I just wish her book was translated. And she ran down every single lead that she could find, because she didn't, from the Japanese point of view, she just wanted to find out whether, in fact, Japan was the perpetrator of any of the crimes that they've, over the years, been accused of being. And so she interviewed every single person, starting with the people that Fred Gorner, who had started the whole thing, interviewed, and in no case was there ever any corroborating evidence that the Japanese had ever picked her up. She wrote it in the 1980s. I had parts of it translated, and then I was lucky and I found out where she lived. So she lives in Walk Hill, New York, and so I called her up, and when we talked. I can't believe it, but there are still people there. I think there are always people who are just mesmerized by what might have happened. The conspiracy theories on every single event in United States history can't seem to be, I mean, they just keep rising up again. She was a social worker at Dennison House in Boston, and she flew in her spare time. She had been in the papers a couple of times because she was a pilot, and she had done a publicity stunt for Dennison House, but she was not. She was just kind of a local celebrity. She was not well known at all. Well, that was just pure luck. Amy Guest had told the lawyer, family friend lawyer, David Lehman, to find somebody to take her place, and he was trying to decide what to do next, it being a little bit out of his line of work, and then George Putnam heard about it through somebody else and went to see him and said that he would like to try and find that woman, and I mean, it was just right up his alley because it's the kind of thing that he'd been doing. And so David Lehman said, okay, sure, you know, have a go at it. And that afternoon, according to Putnam, a friend of his from Boston popped into his office, a publicist friend of his. And so Putnam said, look, this is this most interesting thing that's happening right now. Let's find this woman flyer. Let's find this woman to take the place of Amy Guest. And then, of course, he could see all the possibilities. And it was a really exciting project. So he, in effect, had assigned Hilton Rayleigh, and Hilton lived in Boston, went back to Boston that afternoon, and he asked a friend of his if his friend knew anybody in Boston in the aviation world, and really, there was only Amelia in Boston. So they asked her down in New York, and they interviewed her, and she was perfect, and everybody fell in love with her. And in fact, David Lehman liked her so much, he was, for one moment, Amelia felt, after she wrote about it later, she was afraid that he liked her so much, he was afraid to send her because she might die. So she had to kind of pull back, and she was just going to ride in the plane. There were two pilots, and she was just going to be the passenger. She hoped to be actually to get her hands on the controls, but she never did. So but she was more actually than just a passenger, because whether or not they had originally planned to do this, I don't know. But by the time the plane took off, she was. They had given her authority to run the project. She was, in other words, in control. Until it took off, it wasn't public at all. When it took off, then all of a sudden, the world knew about it, and every reporter that could get on a plane, not a plane, excuse me, but every reporter that could get up there did, so that by the time she was in Trepassey, the publicity was in place. Well, Putnam did. George Putnam did. She was a writer. Even then, she had sold a story to the Bostonian, which was the local Boston magazine, and on the basis, I suppose, of that, or he had sold her story to the New York Times. So she was writing her story while she was on the plane. She was keeping a log when she landed she landed in Buryport, Wales. When she got to London, she handed a story, a finished story, which was published in the papers the next day. There were 3 of them that were on it. The only trouble they had was that they only had 700 gallons of gasoline because they were in a plane which had been fitted out with pontoons. Pontoons don't really, they're not efficient. Once you have pontoons, they can't lift as much as the wheels that they replaced. So although they should have been able to take double the amount of gasoline that they took, they had a great deal of trouble, even becoming airborne, as happened often in those days because the planes were underpowered and the pontoons were just a terrific strain. So they didn't have any really serious problems, except they weren't sure, of course, where they were. When they finally, and then the engine started to sputter, and they were all afraid that they were going to be lost at sea. And then they finally landed in Buryport, Wales. It took 20 hours and 40 minutes. That's the name of her first book. Well, it's so amazing. It's just, it just shows that the state of the world, the world's mindset at the time. It happened immediately when she landed. Nobody paid any attention to Wilmer Stultz and Lou Gordon. They just didn't pay any attention to them at all. And she was continually saying, look, I was just a passenger. I didn't do anything. And then, later she said, I was just a sack of potatoes. I mean, she was always with her arms around them, trying to push them forward. And it was just this stunned amazement of the world that a woman had been able to do this, or that she hadn't passed out, or she hadn't died. It just seemed too incredible to believe. Well, after Lindbergh, because Lindbergh was in May of 27, 18 planes took off, both sides of the Atlantic. 18 planes took off, and 3 made it. Well, most of them died. Most of the people died. Well, because it was like climbing Everest. It was just the most exciting thing that could happen. Hugely expensive. 5 years to the day after Lindbergh, May 21st, 1932, now married to George Putnam. It had always bothered her that she hadn't flown the plane herself, and that she was so much in the public eye, and everybody attributed things to her that she thought she hadn't earned. And she was always she had a very serious side, although she didn't let it show all that much. But she wanted to earn her spurs she felt she hadn't. So she decided, it was something, everybody was calling it the Lindbergh Trail. Every woman every woman flyer wanted to do what Lindbergh had done and be the first woman to solo the Atlantic. And no, there hadn't been any. In fact, nobody had flown the Atlantic alone after Lindbergh, man or woman. But the women particularly were on the Lindbergh Trail, and there were quite a few American women who had planes and were trying. One woman, Ruth Nichols, an American from Rye, New York, had actually tried, and she had crashed before she ever got up to Newfoundland. And there were a couple of others in the wings waiting, getting their planes ready. And Amelia decided that she was going to do it. She didn't tell anybody. She was always a very self-possessed, self-contained person. And so she had the whole thing organized, and exactly 5 years to the day after Lindbergh, she took off from Harbor Grace, Newfoundland, and spanned the Atlantic, and that took 14 and a half hours. And although although her plan was to land at Le Bourget, and the American ambassador and everybody else had gone out to Le Bourget to wait for her, she didn't make France because the winds went against her, and she was also having all kinds of instrument problems. She was in a Lockheed Vega, single-engine Lockheed Vega. By this time, she was very much of a one-woman industry. She was on the lecture circuit, and she was probably, I suppose, the most highly paid woman going around the country. I think it would probably cost about $15,000, but that's probably a guess on my part. The Lockheed Electra that she bought in 1937 cost, fully equipped, $73,000, but that was a much bigger plane. She was very involved in this women's flying organization, the 99s, so she was always, whenever they were doing anything, she was always spending time with them. She was always working with other women to, she gave trophies for various races. She flew in the Bendix. The Bendix was a transatlantic flight, which was it was the most exciting transatlantic flight. Race, excuse me, it was a race. It was the big race. It was the one that got all the publicity. It was started by, Vincent Bendix gave the prize. It was started by a man called Henderson because he wanted to push planes and push pilots. So he got Vincent Bendix to give a prize for the fastest transcontinental flight. She decided that she was going to design wearable women's clothes. She was sick of clothes that weren't wearable, and she thought it would be a good business enterprise. And she loved getting into new businesses. She was always trying different things, and so there she was. She decided to design women's clothes, but she was going to put shirts, and at that point, women's shirts were blouses, and so she designed shirts that were with long enough tails so that if they stood on their head, as she said, they would still stay tucked in. And then she used parachute silk for the blouses, and then she just did very wearable clothes. Yeah, she was the first vice president. Yeah, there were 4 of them. They sat around the house in Rye, and Sam Solomon and Amelia Earhart and Jean Vidal and Paul Collins, and they each threw in $10,000, and they started Northeast Airlines. Well, it's very significant because, to me, I mean, I think it's kind of a hallmark of her personality. I think all of a sudden, Eliot, who was the president, met her and was totally mesmerized by her and wanted to get her on the Purdue campus. And she thought it was a wonderful idea. And I think she would have probably spent the rest of her life doing that, being at Purdue, because she was a strong feminist, although she didn't come across as one. She had very strong beliefs. And what she always wanted to do was to get women to be the best that they could be. She wanted them to lose their sense of inferiority. She was always trying to enhance women's self-esteem. And there she was offered a job to be on the faculty of Purdue, to be a consultant for careers for women. Well, of course, she was a huge hit, and she was there, and the girls just adored her. And I think it was probably very satisfying for her, and I think it would have taken more and more of her time. Well, they kind of did. They kind of did buy her a plane. 2 of the wealthy alumni who were head of the Purdue Research Foundation each kicked in $20,000, and then so that gave her the kind of the nut to buy the Lockheed Electra, and then equipment manufacturers gave her the rest. Well, let's see. She flew from, in 1935, she flew from Hawaii to Oakland, California, in a Vega, and that was the first solo flight over that piece of water. For anybody. No serious problems, no. And then later, in 35, she flew to Mexico City, which is quite high. It's 7,500 feet. And then, which means from an altitude, air is thinner. It's hard to load up enough gasoline. So then she flew from Mexico City to Newark Airport, and that was a first. And first solo, man or woman, nonstop. And for that, she went into the record books again. So she had these great solo flights. She met her right after after Roosevelt was elected to his first term in '32. Yeah. Well, she would have, except that she wanted to have Amelia fly her around so that she could publicize the Arthurdale project, which was subsistence housing in Virginia, and the administration in Rexford Tugwell weren't really ready to have Eleanor Roosevelt do it right then. They were still arranging things. This was quite new and quite radical, and I think probably Tugwell didn't really want her to do it, so he put it off, and then other commitments, time commitments, interfered. Before that, she wanted to learn to fly. Oh, when she first met Amelia, she wanted to learn how to fly, and she wanted Amelia to arrange it, and so Amelia got her a student pilot license, organized a student pilot license for her, and everything was going along absolutely beautifully. She'd organized whoever was going to teach her, and then Eleanor told Franklin, and Franklin said, forget it, no deal. Well, she always wanted, as she told her friend, her flying friend Louise that, and she just wanted to do it because she thought it would be fun, and it was the only flight that she undertook for, in a sense, she said for a selfish reason, because she just wanted to do it. And so she wanted to do it she wanted to go around the world at the world's waistline, 27,000 miles around the equator, which would mean that she wouldn't have to, there were no time constraints. It simply had never been done because there weren't that many people that had flown around the world. And, but it was a huge undertaking. She hoped to do all kinds of experiments and while she was doing this trip, she wanted to see the fatigue factors, and she had all kinds of general things that she was hoping to figure out. Always married to George Putnam. Well, it's very difficult to organize a trip like of that magnitude. I mean, it was very difficult to organize a trip of that magnitude, besides the fact that she had to have gasoline shipped to various places around the world because you couldn't rely on anything. She had to get permissions from every country that she flew over. And basically, Eugene Vidal really organized the trip for her. He put the Department of Commerce for her to use. He assigned an ex-Navy pilot who worked for the Department of Commerce by the name of Bill Miller. He basically assigned him to Amelia to run interference. She had helped Jean Vidal, definitely she'd helped Jean Vidal get the job. She'd not only helped Jean Vidal get the job, she helped him to keep the job, because at one point, Washington being Washington, there were some senators that thought they had a better man for the job, and they were pressuring Franklin Roosevelt to fire Eugene Vidal, at which point, and at one point, Roosevelt actually issued an order saying that he was going to fire Vidal and put in somebody else. And when Amelia heard about it, she sent a blistering telegram. It was just before the 1936 election, Franklin Roosevelt's second term election, and Amelia Earhart sent a blistering telegram to Eleanor Roosevelt saying that if Franklin fired Jean Vidal, she wasn't going to go on. She wasn't going to campaign. Aside from all the other things that she disapproved, and it was a bad thing to do, she said, and furthermore, I'm not campaigning for Franklin if this goes through. So within 48 hours, Franklin Roosevelt was having lunch with Eugene Vidal's boss at the Department of Commerce, because the Bureau of Air Commerce was a sub-department in the Department of Commerce, and he changed his mind, and within 48 hours, Amelia is sending another telegram to Eleanor Roosevelt saying, "Thanks very much. Appreciate your help." They originally took off from California, and it was going to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii it was going to, but then this is the last flight, and then there was an accident taking off. The first time that she started on her round-the-world flight, there was an accident as she took off for Howland Island from Honolulu. She ground looped, and the plane was damaged, and by the time it was fixed, quite a bit of time had gone by, and so weather patterns had changed, and she decided to change the direction of her flight. So then she took off. When she started again, she took off from Miami, June 1st, in the Electra. Just herself and Fred Noonan, just good friends, no relationship. Their first stop was San Juan, Puerto Rico. Then they went down South America, Venezuela, Natal, and then across to Africa. And then they flew across Africa, and then they flew through Pakistan and all those countries. Oh, I'm sorry, Lae, New Guinea. It was, I think it was 28 days later. They'd had minor difficulties with it. There'd been a couple of short circuits in the equipment. They'd had to go back several times when they were in Bandung. She was a syndicated columnist for the Herald Tribune, and every single time she wrote a dispatch, it was on the front page of the Herald Tribune. In the end, nobody can know for sure, except that, I mean, nobody can know the details for sure. But certainly what happened was that there was something wrong. Navigation in those years was not as exact as it is now. I think there was probably an equipment failure. She was not communicating with the people that she was supposed to on Howland Island. And the plane, she was circling. She was definitely circling. They were going north and south. They thought they'd gone far enough east and west. They thought they'd gone far enough. And so they were going north and south was the last communication. And somewhere, somehow, when the plane ran out of gas, they crashed into the sea. The world's reaction was stunned amazement, because she really had never had a problem before, and they couldn't believe it. Her navigator was supposed to have been a very good navigator. He was a good navigator. Later speculation has always centered on the fact that he might have been drinking, because he had an alcoholic past. However, Amelia was much too smart to have taken off with a pilot that wasn't in shape. She was just too intelligent to do something like that. The toughest thing, cutting it down. I had so many more facts than I had room for. Sure, I haven't decided. I'm still decompressing from Amelia. Thank you.